The sky above Calyx 9 was the color of rotting blood, streaked with greasy clouds that never seemed to move. Beneath it, the colony outpost sat like a forgotten relic, gray metal structures layered in dust, half buried in the windswept terrain. Here, silence was its own living entity, heavy and inescapable, save for the faint, grinding hum of machines maintaining life support systems. Inside the colony's hub, Dr. Lena Armitage tapped absent-mindedly on a glass tablet as she reviewed the team's latest data. The air smelled sterile but stale, the kind of scent that reminded her of hospitals and empty rooms. She'd been on Calyx 9 for 3 months with the rest of the team, a skeleton crew of 8 meant to explore and evaluate the planet's potential for resource extraction. Another dead zone, Lena murmured to herself, the report's numbers blurring on the screen. Planet-wide scans showed strange readings, areas where electrical signals failed, and biological life seemed non-existent. It was as though something buried deep below them absorbed energy instead of producing it. She pushed the thought aside. Jared Vex, their most talented researcher, would no doubt have an explanation later. Across the table, Elias Cord watched her quietly. The security officer rarely spoke, which suited Lena fine. He was built like a slab of rock, muscular, his jaw perpetually clenched, and his silence gave him the appearance of someone constantly waiting for disaster. "Jared's late," Elias said finally, his voice low and flat. Lena blinked at the clock. Jared had been gone for hours, off exploring the southern cavern systems, supposedly mapping the twisting rock formations. He'd always been the most eager, the most reckless. "Give him another hour," Lena replied. "You know how he gets when he's on to something." Elias said nothing but stood and checked his firearm as though expecting trouble. Lena didn't argue. Life on Calyx 9 had an edge to it, like they were treading on something that didn't want them there. Hours passed before Jared stumbled back into the colony hub. He was filthy, his suit stained with black dust that clung to his face and boots. His breathing was ragged, his eyes wide, unfocused. "Lena," he whispered, leaning against the doorway. "You need to see this. What happened to you?" Lena stood, already uneasy. Elias appeared at her side like a shadow, one hand resting on his holster. Jared didn't answer. His nose had started to bleed, a single line of crimson trickling to his chin. He wiped it absent-mindedly, smearing dirt and blood together. "Found something in the caverns," Jared continued, his voice trembling. "It's alive. Or it feels alive. I can hear it, Lena, in my head like a pulse." Lena exchanged a glance with Elias. "What did you find?" Jared's eyes met hers, the whites bloodshot and glassy. "Something old, something that's waiting." The cavern was larger than Lena had imagined, vast and cathedral-like, its walls smoothed by time and pressure into curving, unnatural shapes. Streaks of black stone veined the walls, as though something dark and oily had seeped into the rock millennia ago. The air buzzed faintly, a hum Lena could barely feel, deep in her chest like the faint murmur of a heartbeat. Elias swept his flashlight over the walls, his brow furrowed. "This place is unnatural. You sure this isn't a fault line?" Jared had led them here, practically vibrating with nervous energy. He gestured deeper into the cavern. "Look closer." Lena squinted at the walls. At first, it was just rock, odd, blackened patterns, but as she stared, shapes seemed to emerge, not quite fossils, not quite carvings. They were bones, but no creature Lena knew could have left such remnants. Thin, sinuous patterns spiraled through the walls like a network of veins. Bones shouldn't look like this, Elias muttered. He bent to examine a shard jutting from the ground, a long, curved piece like the rib of some grotesque titan. It's hollow. Not just hollow, Jared said. His voice cracked. Listen to it. He lifted a shard he'd brought back earlier. Lena leaned in. Jared tilted the shard, and for a moment, the faint hum grew louder. A low, rhythmic pulse, as though something vast and distant breathed through the stone. Lena recoiled, her skin crawling. That's not natural, she said softly. Elias dropped his shard with a dull clatter. We're leaving. Now. Jared laughed, a sharp, unnatural sound. It doesn't matter. Don't you feel it? He tapped his temple with 2 fingers. It's already here. Lena stepped closer to him. What's here, Jared? Jared stared at her, and for the first time, Lena saw something alien in his expression. He smiled faintly, his lips cracking at the edges. It's in the rock. In us. It's been waiting. The ground trembled. A deep rumble rolled through the cavern, sending dust falling from above. Elias grabbed Lena's arm and pulled her back. We're leaving, he shouted, his voice echoing. Jared didn't move. He was still smiling, his gaze locked on the walls, his breathing fast and shallow. It's beautiful, he whispered. Lena yanked her arm free from Elias and grabbed Jared. Jared, move! Jared's body went rigid in her grip. Then he screamed. It was not the scream of a man, but something primal, raw and agonized. Jared's nose gushed blood, his veins bulging beneath his skin as though something pressed from the inside. His limbs jerked, twisting unnaturally as his scream turned to guttural choking. Get him out, Elias shouted, grabbing Jared's arm. Together, they dragged him back toward the surface, the cavern groaning around them like a living thing. The hum followed them, growing louder, reverberating in Lena's skull like a drumbeat. She gritted her teeth, her vision swimming with spots as they stumbled back into the pale light of Calyx 9 sky. Jared fell limp the moment they reached the colony hub. His breathing was shallow, his skin pale and slick with sweat. Elias stood over him, his face pale. What the hell was that? Lena couldn't answer. She wiped blood from Jared's face, staring at the smear on her palm. It was black. Not blood. Not really. Jared's lips moved, though his eyes were closed. It's awake, he whispered. Lena stared at him, her stomach twisting. She turned to the horizon, to the jagged caverns below the mountains. The hum was still there, faint but persistent, like a distant drumbeat in her chest. The silence was gone. Something else had taken its place. The colony's med bay was small and utilitarian, just a few cots and a handful of outdated medical devices. Jared lay motionless on one of them, his face pale and slick with sweat. His chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular breaths, and the skin beneath his eyes had darkened to an unsettling shade of purple. The quiet in the room felt like the calm before a storm, the sterile hum of machines doing little to mask the unease. Lena Armitage sat beside him, staring at his motionless form. Every so often, Jared's lips would move as though whispering, but no sound came out. She reached out and placed a hand on his wrist, half expecting his veins to pulse under her touch. They didn't. She wondered if it was her imagination that made his skin feel too warm, too soft, like whatever held him together was starting to dissolve. "You need to sleep," Elias said from the doorway, his voice low and rough. He leaned against the frame, his massive frame casting a shadow over the med bay. Lena didn't look up. "I can't. Something's wrong with him, Elias. You think I don't know that? The man's falling apart." "It's more than that," Lena replied. "He's changing." Elias exhaled sharply and crossed his arms. "This planet is poisoning him. Something in that cavern, some kind of parasite or gas. That's what's causing this." Lena shook her head. "I ran every test I could. No infections, no toxins, no pathogens. His blood is clean except for..." She trailed off, biting the inside of her cheek. "Except for what?" Lena turned to face him, finally meeting his gaze. "His blood is thickening, coagulating, almost like it's alive." She gestured to the screen monitoring Jared's vitals. "And look at this, his heart rate, steady as a drumbeat. Too steady, like it's matching something." Elias stepped closer, squinting at the screen. Jared's heartbeat flashed across the monitor in perfect rhythm, the steady pulse unnerving in its unnatural precision. Then, for a moment, the screen flickered, just a blur of static, and Lena swore she heard a faint, vibrating hum coming from the machines. Elias swore under his breath. "What the hell is this place?" Before Lena could answer, a sharp gasp came from Jared's cot. Both of them turned as Jared sat bolt upright, his body convulsing. His eyes snapped open and Lena staggered back. His irises were black, not just darkened or dilated, but pure black, void-like and reflective, as though something was staring back through them. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, a long, rattling exhale echoed through the room, and for an instant, Lena heard it again. That deep, rhythmic hum, vibrating in her bones. "Jared?" Lena whispered, her voice trembling. "Can you hear me?" Jared's head tilted unnaturally to the side, his neck crackling with the motion. Then his lips moved, and words spilled out, not in his voice, but a chorus of layered tones, as though a dozen voices spoke at once. "It wants you to listen." Elias reached for his holstered weapon instinctively, but Lena held up a hand. "No," she snapped. "Put it down. He's not..." She couldn't finish the sentence. Jared wasn't Jared anymore. Not fully. Jared's gaze shifted to her. His black eyes were unblinking, unreadable, but Lena could feel something pressing against her mind, like fingers curling around her thoughts. Her breath hitched and she staggered back. The hum grew louder. Jared convulsed again, his body spasming violently before he collapsed back onto the cot. His chest heaved and the blackness in his eyes slowly ebbed, leaving them bloodshot and dazed. Lena gripped the edge of the table to steady herself, her heart pounding in her ears. "He's connected to it," she whispered. "Whatever's down there, he's linked to it." Elias holstered his weapon, his face ashen. "And what the hell is it?" I don't know, Lena said softly, but we need to figure it out. Hours later, they descended back into the caverns. Lena hadn't wanted to return, but something about Jared's words, "It wants you to listen," had clawed into her mind, leaving her restless. She told herself it was for research, for answers. But in the back of her mind, something urged her forward. She didn't tell Elias about the pressure she'd felt earlier, the faint vibration that seemed to crawl under her skull. This time, the cavern felt different. The air was heavier, the darkness deeper. Elias swept his flashlight over the walls, and the beam illuminated the strange patterns embedded in the stone. The veins, those black, twisting lines, seemed to shimmer faintly under the light, like they were pulsing. Lena felt the hum again, faint but distinct, as though it was alive. "Lena," Elias's voice was tight, "look at this." He pointed to a hollow depression in the ground, a pit partially filled with liquid. At first, Lena thought it was water, but as she stepped closer, she saw it wasn't. The liquid was dark, viscous, and it seemed to ripple despite the still air. "Is that—" Lena hesitated. She crouched down, holding a small sensor above the pool. The readings made no sense, temperature fluctuating wildly, radiation spiking and dropping like a heartbeat. She could feel the hum more clearly now, vibrating through her boots. Then she saw the surface of the pool shift. Something moved beneath it. A shape, long and sinuous, slithered just below the surface before vanishing. Elias cursed and stepped back. "We need to leave." "Wait." Lena didn't move. She leaned closer, her heart pounding as she stared into the dark liquid. For just a moment, her own reflection stared back. But something was wrong. Its eyes were black. And then her reflection smiled. Lena fell back, gasping, as the hum roared to life around them. The cavern trembled, rocks breaking free and shattering on the ground. Elias grabbed her arm and hauled her up. "Run!" he shouted. The hum grew louder, impossibly loud, until it felt like the air itself was shaking. Lena stumbled after Elias as they raced back toward the surface, the cavern quaking around them. She didn't dare look back, but in her mind she could see it. The pool, the shapes moving beneath it, and the veins in the walls pulsing like they were alive. They reached the colony just as the tremors subsided. Lena collapsed to her knees, her ears ringing, her chest heaving. Elias paced behind her, muttering curses under his breath. Lena turned back toward the horizon, where the cavern loomed in the distance. The hum was still there, fainter now, but constant. It was waiting, and in the back of her mind she swore she heard Jared's voice. "It's awake." Lena woke up to the sound of screaming. It was distant, distorted, as though coming through layers of thick, suffocating air. Her body was heavy, her limbs drenched in fatigue, as if she had been submerged underwater. Slowly, the sound sharpened, and she realized it was Elias's voice echoing through the colony's halls. She stumbled to her feet, her mind hazy, the hum vibrating at the back of her skull like an itch she couldn't scratch. The walls seemed closer than before, pressing inward, their metallic surface faintly trembling. She stepped into the corridor. The lights flickered above her, casting jagged shadows that danced along the walls. Elias's voice came from down the hall, raw and desperate. "Get out of my head!" Lena broke into a run, her boots pounding against the floor. The sound of her own footsteps overlapped like there were more people running alongside her, figures just out of sight. She rounded the corner and froze. Elias was on the floor of the main hub, his back against the wall. Blood streaked down his face from deep scratches carved into his scalp, his fingernails jagged and torn. His eyes were wild, unfocused, darting between Lena and something invisible. "Elias!" Lena called, taking a cautious step forward. He flinched violently, pressing his hands to his head. "Make it stop," he choked out. "Lena, it's in me. I can hear them." "Who?" Lena knelt beside him, trying to keep her voice steady. "What are you hearing?" Elias slowly lowered his hands, his breath hitching in his chest. He looked at her, tears cutting through the grime on his face. "Everyone. All of you. I can hear your thoughts, your voices. But they're not yours anymore. They're it." Lena felt her stomach drop. The hum was louder now, no longer a vibration but a chorus, 1,000 whispers threading through the back of her mind, just below the surface of her thoughts. It was impossible to block out, a droning presence that curled and writhed behind her eyes. Elias grabbed her wrist suddenly, his grip ice cold. "We're not alone here," he whispered. "It's not just the planet, Lena. It's us. It's using us." A sharp bang echoed through the hall, metal on metal. Lena turned toward the sound, her heart leaping into her throat. The lights flickered again, longer this time, plunging the hub into near darkness. When the lights returned, Jared was standing at the end of the corridor. Except it wasn't Jared. His body was thinner now, stretched and angular, his skin as pale as the light outside. His veins, those black, pulsing lines, ran up his neck and across his face like living tattoos. His eyes were solid black, twin voids that swallowed all light. He smiled faintly, lips cracked and bleeding. "Why are you running?" he asked, his voice layered with multiple tones, each word vibrating in Lena's chest. "You don't have to fight. It's so much easier if you let it in." Lena staggered to her feet, pulling Elias up with her. "We need to go," she hissed, her voice barely audible over the rising hum. Jared's smile widened, the skin at the corners of his mouth splitting like overripe fruit. "You can't escape. You're already part of us." The hum crescendoed into a roar. Lena turned and bolted, dragging Elias behind her as Jared's laughter echoed down the halls. She didn't look back, but she heard it. Footsteps, not just Jared's, but dozens of others, pounding in unison behind them. They barricaded themselves in the control room, a small chamber filled with outdated screens and blinking monitors. Elias slumped against the door, panting, his eyes squeezed shut as though trying to block out the sound inside his head. Lena moved to the central console, hands shaking as she activated the perimeter cameras. The screens flickered to life, but the images they showed made her blood run cold. Outside, the landscape was moving, breathing. The black veins they had seen in the caverns were now spreading across the surface of the planet like cracks in glass. From those veins, shapes emerged, human-like forms dragging themselves free, their bodies half-formed, faces twisted and indistinct. Lena's hands hovered over the controls. "It's spreading," she whispered. Elias groaned, his head pressed against the door. "It's us, Lena. It's using us to build itself." She turned to him. "What do you mean?" Elias opened his eyes, and for a split second, Lena saw the black creeping into his irises. He blinked, forcing it back, his jaw clenched in agony. It's in our heads, our thoughts, our memories. It's feeding off them. We're nodes in its system now. A hive. There's no escape. Lena's mind raced. She thought of Jared's words. It's awake, and the hum that had been with them since the caverns. The planet wasn't just alive. It was intelligent, a sentient organism spreading itself through anything that touched it. "We need to destroy the colony," she said suddenly, her voice sharp. Elias stared at her, his face pale. "Destroy it? And us with it?" "It's already in us, Elias. If we don't stop it here, it'll reach Earth. Do you want this thing spreading across the entire planet?" Elias didn't answer. He was trembling, sweat pouring down his face. Lena watched in horror as his fingers twitched and elongated, the bones beneath his skin shifting. He looked at his hands with wide, terrified eyes. "No," he whispered. No, get out of me." "Elias!" Lena cried, reaching for him. He shoved her back, his face contorting in pain. "Run," he rasped, "before I—" The sentence was cut off by a sickening crack. His body seized, his head snapping back as black tendrils erupted from his mouth, his eyes, his hands. Lena stumbled backward, tears blurring her vision as Elias's body collapsed to the ground in a heap of twitching limbs. The door shuddered behind her. Jared's voice echoed through the control room. "You can't hide forever, Lena. You're already part of us. You'll see soon enough. We're connected. We are one." Lena backed away from the door, her mind spinning. She turned to the console and activated the colony's self-destruct sequence, her fingers trembling as she entered the override codes. 10 minutes to detonation, the mechanical voice announced. The door groaned. Something hit it, something heavy, wet and relentless. Jared's voice came again, lower this time, reverberating through her bones. "You can't escape the Hive, Lena. You're already home." Lena looked at the control screen one last time. Outside, the black veins were crawling closer, spreading like a cancer, the Hive consuming everything in its path. She turned and ran, the hum filling her mind until she couldn't hear her own thoughts anymore. The air inside the colony was thick with the hum, suffocating and relentless. It was no longer just a sound, it was alive, vibrating through Lena's bones, pressing against her skull like an unseen hand trying to crack it open. She staggered through the corridors, her boots splashing through shallow pools of black liquid that now seeped up from the floors. The walls pulsed faintly, veined with that dark, viscous substance, as if the colony itself was merging with the planet. The countdown echoed faintly in her ears. 6 minutes to detonation. Her breath came in ragged bursts, her body aching as if something was eating her from the inside. Behind her, the doors shuddered and groaned as the things, them, pounded against the metal. Jared's voice called out, though she knew he was no longer Jared. "Why fight it, Lena? You're already one of us. You've always been one of us." Lena's trembling fingers gripped the straps of the oxygen pack she'd scavenged from the storage room. She had one chance. If she could make it to the landing shuttle and launch before the detonation, she could leave the colony, leave it behind. She didn't know if the Hive could follow, but the thought of dying here, becoming part of that collective thing, was far worse. She pushed into the airlock chamber. The small window offered a view of the desolate landscape outside, the cracked earth now streaked with black veins spreading like a spider web. In the distance, the cavern mouth seemed wider, almost alive, tendrils of mist curling upward into the crimson sky. The hum was louder here, impossibly loud. Lena clutched the sides of her head, gritting her teeth as a voice, no, voices, whispered at the edges of her mind. "You are not alone. We are here. We are everywhere." "No," she hissed through her teeth, slamming her palm against the control panel. The outer doors began to slide open, releasing a rush of stale, metallic air. She stumbled out, the ground soft and shifting under her boots, as though the planet resisted her escape. The shuttle loomed ahead, squat and angular, half buried in the dark dust. It was barely functional, an escape pod designed for emergencies, but it would do. She could feel the hum creeping closer now, crawling into her skull, scraping at her thoughts. 4 minutes to detonation. Lena climbed the shuttle's ramp and sealed the hatch behind her, her hands shaking so violently it took 3 tries to punch in the ignition sequence. The lights inside flickered to life, dim and unsteady. The engines groaned as if waking from a long sleep, vibrating beneath her feet. She fell into the pilot's seat, her chest heaving, and glanced at her reflection in the cracked console screen. Her face was pale, streaked with sweat and dirt. The veins at her temples were darker now, faintly pulsing. Her left eye had darkened, the iris tinged with black. Lena squeezed her eyes shut. You can still make it out. You can still escape. 2 minutes to detonation. The shuttle shuddered violently as the engines kicked into a low roar. Through the cracked windshield, she could see the planet moving, breathing, like the ground itself was rippling. Black tendrils erupted from the earth, reaching skyward, growing longer, stronger. She swore she could see human shapes in the tendrils, faces frozen mid-scream, their limbs tangled and fused. A voice whispered in her mind, soft and gentle now like a lullaby. "Don't leave us, Lena. You are part of us. You will never be alone again." Her head snapped back, and for a moment she felt her body lift from the seat, as if invisible threads were pulling her upward. Her vision blurred, flashes of blackened caverns and spreading veins filling her mind. "You are home," Lena screamed, wrenching her body forward, slamming the ignition controls. The shuttle lurched violently, and the thrusters roared to life, propelling the ship upward. The force pressed her into the seat, her breath ragged, the hum in her skull screaming as though the Hive itself was trying to drag her back. Through the windshield, the colony grew smaller beneath her. The ground split apart, black veins spreading faster now, writhing like a nest of snakes. Then, in one blinding moment, the colony exploded. A burst of white fire erupting into the crimson sky. The shockwave hit the shuttle, sending it spinning. Lena clung to the controls, teeth gritted as the ship steadied itself. The planet was silent now, its surface a smoldering ruin. But Lena knew it wasn't over. She could still feel it inside her. A weight, a vibration just beneath the surface of her mind. The shuttle drifted through space, surrounded by the empty void. Hours passed, or maybe days. Lena couldn't tell. Her reflection in the glass was different now. The black veins had spread across her neck, her eyes sunken and bloodshot. She could still hear them, faint whispers like a distant echo, pressing against the edges of her thoughts. She looked at the navigation panel. Earth was marked on the display, a blinking dot growing closer by the hour. Her hands trembled as she reached for the console's comm system. She could send a warning. She could tell Earth to stay away, to leave Calyx 9 alone. But as she leaned closer, her breath caught in her throat. The whisper grew louder. "Don't tell them. We need them. We will grow. We will thrive." Lena's hands hovered above the controls. Her head ached, the pressure unbearable. For one fleeting moment, she fought back, her voice breaking as she whispered into the silence. "Please, stop." The hum filled her mind, drowning her thoughts. Her reflection in the glass smiled faintly, though she hadn't moved her lips. Days later, Earth's orbital radar detected an incoming vessel. Its signal was weak. The data scrambled. Ground control hailed it repeatedly, but no response came. The shuttle drifted silently toward the atmosphere, its hull blackened and scarred. Inside, Lena sat motionless in the pilot's seat, her face serene. Her veins had spread completely now, her skin pale and translucent. Her mouth moved, whispering softly to no one. "We are one. We are home." As the shuttle broke through the clouds, the black veins on its hull began to spread. The hum resonated faintly over Earth's communication systems. The last thing anyone heard before the shuttle crashed was a single, pulsing sound, steady, rhythmic, alive. And then the whispers began.